He shielded the alien queen with his life. Now 2 queens owe him everything. The blade was already moving before I understood what my hand was doing. That is the only honest way I know how to start this. Not with the politics, not with the grand setting of the Galactic Compact Summit, not with the glittering chandeliers made of bioluminescent crystal that hung above 300 delegates from 40 worlds. Those things matter, but they are not where this story lives. This story lives in a single second, a fraction of a second really, when my body decided something before my brain caught up. But you need the before or the after means nothing, so let me give it to you. My name is Sergeant Marcus Vale, and 6 months ago I was the least important soldier in the Compact Security Corps. I say that without bitterness. It was simply true. I had a file that most commanders would describe as complicated, which is the polite word officers use when they mean technically competent but extremely difficult to work with. I had 3 formal reprimands, 2 commendations, and 1 incident aboard the relay station at Caldun Point that nobody above my pay grade ever wanted to discuss out loud again. The result of all of this was that I ended up here, on the most boring, most symbolic, most pointless posting the Corps could find. Bodyguard Detail, Queen Serapith of the Viren Hive. I want you to understand what that means before you assume it sounds impressive. The Viren are an insectoid species. They have existed as an interstellar civilization for roughly 4,000 years, which makes humanity look like a child who just learned to walk. Their queens are surrounded at all times by warrior drones, living, breathing weapons that can stop a plasma round with their exoskeleton and shrug it off like a minor inconvenience. Each drone is faster than any human soldier, stronger than any human soldier, and specifically evolved over millennia to protect the queen at the cost of their own existence. The Viren queens are, by every measurable standard, the most protected beings in the known galaxy. So what exactly was Sergeant Marcus Vale supposed to contribute? Nothing. That was the honest answer. I was there to be a symbol, a gesture from Earth's government to the Viren Empire that said, in the universal language of bureaucratic theater, "We respect your queen enough to send someone." It was an honor posting the way a participation ribbon is an honor. The Corps made no effort to pretend otherwise. When my superior, Lieutenant Colonel Diane Farrow, handed me the assignment packet, she said 3 words and then looked at her desk screen as if I had already left the room. "Don't embarrass us." That was it, not protect the queen, not do your job well, just don't embarrass us. The implication was clear. Stand in the corner, look official, stay out of the way of the actual security detail, and for the love of everything, do not cause another Caldun Point situation. I boarded the diplomatic transport to the summit station at Vethari Orbital, a massive ring-shaped structure in neutral space where the Compact held its annual treaty conferences, and spent the 14-hour transit reading every piece of intelligence I could find on the Viren Hive, on Queen Serapith, on the current political tensions within the Hive's internal factions, and on the summit agenda itself. Not because I had been asked to. Nobody had asked me to do anything except exist. I did it because I have always been the kind of person who cannot sit still without filling the time with something useful, and because, though I would not have admitted this to anyone, the Caldun Point situation had started because I had not been paying enough attention at the wrong moment, and I had made a private promise to myself that it would not happen again. The station was extraordinary. I will give it that. Vethari Orbital was designed to accommodate species of 40 different biologies, which meant it had sections pressurized differently, sections lit in spectrums invisible to human eyes, sections kept at temperatures that would have put a human in the medical bay within minutes. The diplomatic wing, where I was assigned, was maintained at comfortable human standard warm light, breathable air, gravity calibrated to Earth normal. It smelled faintly of something metallic and sweet, that I later learned was the incense burned by the Mulhari trade delegation 3 corridors over. I met Queen Saravith for the first time in the receiving hall on the day of my arrival. She was larger than I expected. Viren queens are significantly bigger than their drones, taller, broader in the chest and shoulder, with 4 upper limbs instead of 2, and a set of compound eyes that catch light in a way that makes them look, from certain angles, like they are looking at everything in the room simultaneously. Which, I was told, they essentially are. Her outer shell was a deep amber brown, polished to a shine that seemed less decorative and more simply natural. She wore no armor because her body was the armor. She wore a sash of deep red fabric across her 2 primary shoulders, a formal diplomatic gesture, borrowed from compact convention, that meant she was here in peace. She looked at me the way you look at furniture that has been placed in an inconvenient spot. "You are the human bodyguard," she said. Her translator implant converted her speech into flat, precise English. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty," I said. She looked at me for 2 more seconds. Then she turned away and began speaking with her senior drone guard in the rapid clicking language of the hive, which my implant could not parse at that speed. I did not need a translation. The body language was universal enough. I took my place at the edge of the room and began doing the thing that I was actually good at, even if nobody knew it or had asked me to do it. I began watching. The summit had 17 formal sessions scheduled across 5 days. I attended all of them. I stood at the periphery of every meeting, every reception, every working dinner. I was invisible to everyone in the room, which I had learned long ago is one of the most useful things a person can be. Invisible people see what visible people miss. And over the first 3 days, I began to see something that sat in the back of my mind like a pebble in a boot. I could not explain it. Not yet. It was too small. A drone that moved differently than the others. A subset of the Queen's staff that held themselves slightly apart from the main guard formation, not enough to be noticed by someone not looking for it, but enough that I noticed it, because I was looking for exactly this kind of thing and I could not have told you why. Old instinct. The call-done point kind of instinct. The kind that had cost me a reprimand and earned me a commendation in the same week, depending on which officer you asked. I almost reported it. I drafted a preliminary observation note and then looked at it and thought about what Lieutenant Colonel Farrow had said. "Don't embarrass us." A human sergeant flagging behavioral irregularities in a Viren Royal Guard would not be received well. It would be dismissed. I would be told, politely, that I did not understand Viren formation protocols, which was true, and that I should focus on my ceremonial duties, which was insulting. I kept watching instead. On the second day I also noticed, for the first time, Queen Delira. She was a sub-queen of the Viren Hive, a title that, in human political terms, maps only imperfectly. Think of her as a regional governor with her own military and her own court, technically beneath Saravith in the hive hierarchy, but practically powerful enough that the relationship was more complicated than the titles suggested. She was here for the trade route negotiations, which was the summit's primary agenda, and she and Saravith shared the summit in the way that 2 people share a kitchen when they are not exactly sure they like each other. Delira was slightly smaller than Saravith, with a shell that was darker, almost black in low light, deep greenish-brown in direct illumination. Where Saravith had the bearing of someone who had been a queen for long enough that authority had become indistinguishable from personality, Delira had the bearing of someone who had earned everything she had and wanted you to know it without having to say so. She noticed me noticing things on the second day. I felt her compound eyes track me from across the reception hall, and I had the unsettling sensation of being catalogued. Later that evening, she passed me in the corridor outside the diplomatic wing and paused. "You watch the room," she said. It was not an accusation. It was more like a note someone makes to themselves out loud. "It's my job," I said. "It is not the job they gave you," she said. Then she walked on. I stood in the corridor for a moment, alone, and thought about that. Then I went back to my room, made a cup of terrible coffee from the compact tissue supply pack in my kit, and wrote 3 more pages of observation notes that no one had asked for and no one was going to read. The summit's third night was the formal state dinner. 300 delegates, 40 species, 17 courses of food modified to be technically safe for whatever biology was seated at each table. The hall was enormous and spectacular in the cold, precise way of things designed to impress rather than welcome. I was positioned near the Eastern Service corridor, out of the way, unobtrusive, officially present. I was watching the drones, specifically the ones who moved differently. And at the 7th course, I saw it. Not a weapon, not a signal, just a look, a fraction of a second exchange between a drone near the east wall and another near the raised dais where both queens were seated. The kind of look that means we go on 3. The kind of look I had seen once before, in a different context, on a different station, and had spent 2 years wishing I had acted on sooner. I was already moving before I finished the thought. That is the only honest way I know how to tell it. The distance from where I was standing to the raised dais was 11 meters. I had measured it twice, the first day, without knowing why. I measured things like that the way other people check their pockets before leaving a room automatically, without thinking too hard about it. I covered those 11 meters in the next 2 seconds. The drone near the east wall moved at the same moment I did. It was faster than me. Viren warrior drones are always faster than humans in a straight sprint, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But it had to cover more ground, and it had not expected a human to be moving at all. In the scenario that drone had prepared for, the human in the corner was furniture. Furniture does not sprint. I hit the first drone from the side, not the front. Not because I had planned it that way, I had not planned anything. There was no time for plans, but because the angle worked out that way and my body committed to it before the calculation finished. We went down together. It was not graceful. The floor of the summit hall was polished stone, and it made a sound I would prefer not to describe when we hit it. The drone was strong, extraordinarily strong. I was aware of this in the way that you are aware of cold water when someone pours it over you, fully, immediately, and with no useful recourse. My right arm locked up from the shoulder down in the first second of contact, pinned under something that weighed approximately twice what I did and had the tensile strength of structural cable. I used my left arm and my legs, and what I can only describe as a very personal relationship with the concept of not dying, and I kept it down. Across the dais, Queen Saravith had risen from her seat. Her drones were reacting, but they were reacting to the wrong thing to me, because a human soldier tackling a Royal Guard drone was the more visible and comprehensible event. They had not yet seen what I had seen. The second drone, the one near the far pillar, the one who had traded that look, was already moving. It was moving toward Delira. Saravith's guard had not registered it yet because their formation protocols were oriented toward their own queen. Delira's personal guard had been redirected during the seating compact protocol, mixed delegation seating, and she had a gap. There was a war staff mounted on the dais railing. Decorative, I had assumed when I first saw it. Ceremonial. The kind of thing that looks like a weapon because it used to be one 300 years ago and is now kept around for aesthetic reasons. I had measured it with my eyes on the first day because I measure things. It was in my left hand before I had consciously decided to reach for it. I released the first drone, which immediately tried to get up and immediately encountered the issue of having its primary leg joint compromised from the fall and through the staff. I did not throw it at the drone. I threw it into the gap between the drone and Delira. The staff hit the floor at an angle and skidded directly into the drone's path. 200 kilograms of moving Viren warrior drone hit a 3-meter hardwood pole at full momentum and went sideways in a way that physics, at least, is perfectly consistent about. Delira had not moved. She was still seated, compound eyes fixed on me, and I could read absolutely nothing in them. The hall had gone completely silent. I was standing on the dais now, though I did not remember climbing it. My right arm still was not working properly. There was something warm on the left side of my face, which I noted and filed for later. The first drone was down. The second drone was down. 3 other drones near the east wall had stopped moving, and I realized in the next half-second that this was because about 40 compact security officers had poured in through the service corridor and were currently pointing an impressive quantity of hardware at everything in the room, including, I noted without surprise, me. I held up my one working arm, empty hand. Lieutenant Colonel Farrow appeared at the edge of the security cordon approximately 90 seconds later. She looked at the scene. She looked at the 2 drones on the floor. She looked at the 2 queens on the dais, both unharmed, both very still. She looked at me. The expression on her face was something I had never seen before on a superior officer and could not quite name. It was somewhere between horrified and stunned, with a border region that might have been, if I was reading it generously, a small amount of awe. She said nothing for a long moment. Then Vale. "Ma'am, what did you do to your arm?" That was when I noticed that the warm feeling had spread and my legs were doing something unreliable. I sat down on the dais step, which I decided was not dramatic because I did it very calmly and on purpose. The compact medic reached me about 30 seconds later and started running a scanner over my arm, my ribs, my head, all 3 of which, I was informed with professional briskness, had sustained what she called significant trauma. "You took 3 hits," the medic said. She was young, human, and currently looking at her scanner with the expression of someone whose data is telling them something they want to verify twice. All 3 were deflected. How did you deflect 3 hits from a Viren warrior drone? "I didn't deflect them," I said. "I just didn't stop moving after they landed." She looked at me. "That's not how this works," she said. "I know," I said. "My species hasn't really sorted that out yet." She did not laugh. She was too busy stabilizing my arm, which I was grateful for because it had started to inform me, with increasing clarity, that it was very unhappy with recent decisions. I focused on the ceiling of the summit hall, the bioluminescent chandeliers, which were still on, still glowing their cold and beautiful light over a scene that had completely transformed in under 4 minutes. That was when I noticed Queen Saravith standing 2 meters from me. She had not approached loudly. Viren queens move with the kind of quiet that is less about stealth and more about confidence, the silence of something that does not need to announce itself. She was looking down at me with her compound eyes, and her expression was, to me, unreadable. But she was there. She had walked to where I was sitting on the step of the dais, dismissed her own drones back to their positions with a single hand gesture, and simply stood. The medic glanced up, registered what was standing above her patient, and very carefully focused back on her scanner. "You are injured," Saravith said. It came out flat through the translator, the way everything did, but there was a quality to the timing of it that felt different from her earlier dismissal. "Yes, Your Majesty," I said. "You placed yourself between an armed drone and my person," she said. "Yes." "Why?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. The truthful answer was that I had not thought about it, which felt like an inadequate answer to give to a queen. But it was the only honest one I had. "It's what I'm here for," I said. She was quiet for a moment that was long enough that I started to wonder if I had said something wrong in a cultural context I was not equipped to navigate. "No," she said finally. "It is not what you were sent here for. You were sent here to stand in a corner." She was not wrong. I did not say anything. She looked at me for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and walked back to her drones without another word, but before she reached them, she paused with her back still to me and said something quiet and precise, and even through the translator implant, I caught the weight of it. "You will not be returned to the corner," she said. "I will ensure it." Then she was gone, back to the controlled chaos of her guard formation, and I was left sitting on the step with a medic wrapping my arm and the summit hall slowly filling with voices again. The sound of 300 delegates processing what they had just witnessed. Delira had not spoken yet. She was still seated at the dais table, both primary hands flat on the surface, watching me with the same cataloging attention she had used in the corridor 2 days earlier. After a long moment, she picked up the warstaff from the floor, the one I had thrown, and set it carefully back on the dais railing. "Accurate throw," she said, "for a species with only 2 arms." "Thank you," I said, and then because I could not help it, I had a good angle. There was a pause. Then something happened in Delira's expression that might have been, depending on how generously you read an alien face, the very beginning of a smile. The compact medical team arrived in force at that point, and the moment ended, swallowed by the logistics of aftermath. I was transferred to the station medical wing, and the hall was cleared for security sweep, and 3 different officers tried to take my preliminary statement simultaneously, which resulted in none of them getting a coherent one. I lay on the medical bay cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about the look I had seen pass between the drones, the one that meant we go on 3, the one I had recognized and had moved on, and had not been fast enough to fully stop 2 drones down, but the rogue cell was larger than 2. Compact security would find the rest, or they would not, and something worse would be coming. I closed my eyes. Pharaoh appeared in the medical bay doorway about an hour later. She looked at me for a moment in silence. Then she pulled up a chair, sat down, and said nothing for approximately 30 seconds, which was, in my experience, a lieutenant colonel building up to something. "You wrote 11 pages of observation notes," she said finally, "that no one asked for, about irregular formation behavior in the Queen's Guard. The notes were time-stamped across 3 days. You identified the threat 2 hours before it moved." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "You didn't report it." "I didn't think it would be received well." She was quiet again. Then, "You were probably right." A pause. "That's a problem we're going to have to work on." I looked at the ceiling. "You saved both queens," she said. "The medical team is saying I shouldn't have survived the physical contact with the drone," I said. "I know," Pharaoh said. 3 different species on the medical staff have filed reports asking for a biological review of human pain tolerance and adrenaline response times." She paused. "I don't think they meant it as a compliment." "I know," I said. "It is one, though," she said quietly. She stood up, tucked her chair back, and walked to the door. Then she stopped. "Vale, the preliminary diplomatic communications from the Viren Hive came in 20 minutes ago. Queen Saravith has requested, formally, through official Hive channels, that you remain assigned to her court." A beat. Queen Delira sent a separate communication requesting the same thing. She left. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. I lay on the medical bay cot with one arm in a stabilization brace and 3 cracked ribs and a head that was making a persistent argument against bright lights. And I thought about what it meant that 2 queens who had barely looked at me 3 days ago now wanted me to stay. I did not have an answer that night. I would spend the next several months finding one. I did not walk out of the medical bay so much as I was reluctantly permitted to leave it after 2 days of what the compact medics described as accelerated recovery, and I described as lying very still and letting expensive alien technology do things to my arm that I preferred not to watch. The Hive medical team had sent their own physicians on the 2nd day. Queen Saravith's personal healer arrived without announcement, ran a scanner over me with the cool efficiency of someone performing a technical audit, made a series of clicks and tones I could not parse, and then said through a translation assistant, "A different model than the standard compact implant, higher quality, far faster. Your recovery rate is anomalous." "I hear that a lot," I said. "For your species," she clarified. "Still hear it a lot," I said. She did not engage with that. She left a small case of Viren biological accelerants and instructions for the compact medical team on how to administer them, and then walked out in the same unhurried way she had walked in. I was discharged the next morning. My arm still had a dull complaint to register at certain angles. Everything else had settled into a manageable background presence that I had learned, over 12 years in the Corps, to simply file under ongoing and continue working. Lieutenant Colonel Farrow briefed me in a small conference room off the station's administrative corridor. She had a datapad. She did not look at it much. She had already read it so many times she had simply decided to speak. "The compact has a problem," she said. "And because the compact has a problem, Earth has a problem. And because Earth has a problem, you have a problem." "What kind of problem?" I said. "The Viren hive has a cultural legal doctrine called Velsha," she said. "You've read the briefing materials." I had. Not the standard briefing materials. Those were 3 paragraphs that said Velsha was a traditional honor bond, and that humans should remain respectful of its significance. I had gone to the Compact's anthropological archives and read 600 pages of field documentation compiled over 40 years of compact Viren relations. "Life debt," I said. "Not metaphorical, not ceremonial. It supersedes rank, treaty law, hive hierarchy, and personal will. A queen who owes Velsha to a non-Viren is the single most unprecedented diplomatic situation in the history of the Compact's relationship with the hive." Farrow looked at me with an expression that said she had not expected me to know all of that, which told me she had still, somehow, not fully revised her model of who I was. "Both queens," she said. "Both queens," I agreed. "The Hive Council is in session," Farrow said. "They have been in session since the night of the incident. The Compact's diplomatic corps is in session. The Secretary General has been on calls for 36 hours. Everyone is trying to figure out how a human sergeant managed to create a diplomatic situation that has no historical precedent and no established protocol." "By saving 2 queens," I said. "By saving 2 queens," she said, with the tone of someone for whom that sentence still did not fully compute. "The Compact's first instinct, and I want to be honest with you about this, was to quietly reassign you to another posting and let the Hive Council determine on their own how to process the Velsha question." I said nothing. "That instinct lasted approximately 3 hours, Farrow said. "Both queens sent formal diplomatic communications stating that reassigning you would constitute a Velsha violation and would be interpreted as an act of deliberate cultural disrespect toward the Viren hive." She set the datapad down. The Compact backed off. "How far off?" I said. "You've been promoted," she said, "to Staff Sergeant, Compact Interspecies Liaison Corps. It's a new designation. They created it this morning." I looked at her. "It gives you cross-court access privileges and a diplomatic classification that makes you, technically, untouchable by standard Corps reassignment procedures," she said. "You answer directly to the Compact Diplomatic Board, not to the Corps chain of command. You are, effective immediately, the most diplomatically protected human in the galaxy." She said it without pride. She said it like someone reporting a weather event, something that had happened and needed to be acknowledged regardless of how anyone felt about it. "And what does the liaison position actually require me to do?" I said. "We're still working that out," she said. That was how I became something the Compact's entire bureaucratic history had no existing box for. I met with Queen Saravith on the 4th day after the incident. Not in a formal setting. She sent word through her senior drone coordinator that she would speak with me in the secondary receiving room adjacent to her guest quarters, which was as close to informal as a Viren Queen's schedule got. I arrived on time. I sat in the chair indicated. The drones positioned themselves at the room's perimeter, and then, at a click from the Queen, stepped outside and closed the door. I registered the significance of that and did not comment on it. Saravith stood, she did not sit, in this context, the way a human might sit for a conversation. She stood the way her species stood when they were being deliberate about something, weight distributed, primary limbs folded at the first joint. She looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. "Velsha is not a word we use lightly," she said. "I know," I said. "My Hive Council has spent 4 days attempting to find a legal framework that classifies the situation as something other than Velsha," she said. "They have not succeeded. The incident meets every definitional criterion. You placed your living body between an active threat and my person with no reasonable expectation of personal survival." She paused. "That is the full and exact definition." "I understand," I said. "Do you understand what it means?" she said, "in practical terms for a queen?" I had read enough to have a working answer. A queen who holds Velsha to another person cannot, under Hive law, act against that person's interests, cannot order harm toward them, cannot support political action against them, cannot exclude them from information that affects their well-being. It was, in effect, a permanent and binding protection that cut directly across the Queen's authority to operate freely. "I understand it constrains you," I said. "It does not constrain me," she said, with a sharpness that I filed as important. "Velsha is not a chain. It is an acknowledgement. It is the Hive's recognition that survival is not given, it is received. And when it is received from another living being at great personal cost, that being is owed something that has no political equivalent and no expiration." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been queen for 19 years. In that time I have granted Velsha twice, to drones who gave their lives in my defense. I have never received it." "And now you have," I said. "And now I have," she said, "from a human sergeant who was sent here to stand in a corner." I thought about what to say to that. I decided on the truth. "I wasn't going to just stand there," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "No," she said, "I can see that now. I could not see it before because I was not looking." A pause. "My counsel says your presence in my court creates political complications." "I imagine it does," I said. "They are not wrong," she said. "They are also not the first consideration." She moved toward the window of the receiving room, a long panel that looked out on the ring structure of Vethari Orbital, the stars beyond it, the slow rotation of the station against the dark. "You will remain assigned to my court as Velsha-bound advisor. This is a formal title held in Hive law. It has not been given to a non-Viren before. It will cause talk." "I can manage talk," I said. "I know," she said, and then, without turning from the window, "You called me Your Majesty every time you addressed me during that event." "Correct protocol," I said. "You were bleeding on my dais step and still observing protocol." "I wasn't sure what else to do," I said honestly. She turned then, and I saw something in her expression that I did not have a word for, not softness, exactly, because nothing about Saravith was soft, but something that was not the furniture dismissal of our first meeting, something that was a reckoning, and I was part of what it was reckoning with. "You may call me Sira," she said. "In private contexts, it is the short form. It is used between members of a Velsha bond." "Thank you," I said. "Marcus is fine for me." "Marcus," she said, as if testing the shape of it through the translator. She nodded once. "Then, you should eat something. The compact's catering is insufficient for your recovery." That was how we ended the first real conversation we ever had, with her telling me to eat. I found it, somehow, completely appropriate. Delira requested a meeting on the same day, a timing that I suspected was not coincidental, because Delira struck me as the kind of person who monitors other people's schedules as a matter of habit. She came to the medical wing where I was still technically logged as a patient, which gave her meeting a plausible excuse for its informality. She brought no attendants. She sat across from me without the careful positioning that Saravath used, and she simply looked at me with her compound eyes and said, without preamble, "Why? Not what did you do or how did you survive? Why? Why did I act?" I said. "You could not have calculated survival odds," she said. "The probability of a human soldier incapacitating a Viren warrior drone without sustaining lethal injury is, by any reasonable metric, very low. You had no tactical advantage. You had no enhanced equipment. You had a decorative staff and an angle." A pause. "Why?" I thought about it. I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "I don't know," I said. "I saw it happening and I moved. I wasn't calculating, I just went." She was quiet for a long moment. "That is the part my analysts cannot model," she said. "We understand calculated sacrifice. We understand tactical commitment. We understand trained response. What we do not have a model for is action that precedes calculation entirely." She tilted her head in a gesture I had already come to recognize as Viren thoughtfulness. "Your species does this often." "More than we should, probably," I said. "It gets us into trouble. It also occasionally gets us out of it." "I see," she said. She was quiet again. Then, "Velsha, in my court's understanding, applies to the intent as much as the outcome. You did not act to earn Velsha. You did not know what Velsha was when you moved." "Correct," I said. "That makes it more binding, not less," she said. "Our ancient law accounts for this. Velsha freely given by someone who expects nothing is the highest form." She paused. "You saved my life, Marcus Vale, without knowing who I was or what you would receive for it." "I would have done it regardless," I said. "I know," she said. "That is precisely the point." She stood, and I thought the meeting was over, but she paused at the door. "I am told you made an observation in the corridor 2 days before the incident," she said. "That you watched the room." "Yes," I said. "How long had you been watching for something specific?" 3 days, I said. "I started noting the irregular formation behavior on day 1. She turned fully and looked at me. "And you said nothing," she said. "No one would have listened," I said. She regarded me for a moment with something that was harder to read than Saravath's expressions. Then she said, "They will listen now." She left. The door closed behind her quietly. I sat in the medical bay and thought about what she had said, and about what it meant, and about the fact that I had come to Vethari Orbital as an afterthought and was leaving it, whenever I eventually left it, as something the compact did not yet have a proper name for. That seemed about right for a human. I got up, found the terrible coffee in my kit, and wrote 15 more pages of observation notes that nobody had asked for. Some habits, I had decided, were worth keeping. The compact gave me a new uniform to go with the new title. It was the same cut as the standard Liaison Corps uniform, clean lines, dark blue-gray fabric, compact crest on the shoulder, but with a secondary crest I had never seen before stitched below it. The Viren Hive glyph, rendered in amber thread. 3 of the compact staff who saw it stopped and looked twice. One of them actually reversed direction and walked back past me a second time to look again. I put it on, drank my coffee, and went to work. The next 6 months were the strangest of my life, and I have a life that had already contained enough strangeness to fill a medium-length memoir. I spent that time split between 2 courts, Saravath's primary hive delegation that remained at Vethari Orbital for extended treaty proceedings, and Delira's court at her own regional hub station 3 transit hours away. I traveled between them on a schedule that I largely determined myself, because nobody had written a protocol for what I was supposed to be doing, and so I wrote it. My actual function, which I developed over those months out of necessity and without anyone's explicit approval, was this. I was the only person in the galaxy who had unfettered access to both queens and who was trusted, under Velsha, by both of them without political reservation. That meant I heard things that neither queen could tell the other directly, and it meant I was positioned, if I chose to be, to say things that the Compact's diplomatic corps had been trying to say for years without success. Saravith and Dalira's relationship was complicated in the way that powerful people with overlapping territories and different philosophies are always complicated. They did not dislike each other, not exactly, but they occupied the same political space the way two fires occupy the same room, each aware of the other's heat, each adjusting its shape accordingly, each one capable of going much larger if the conditions changed. I did not try to resolve that. It was not mine to resolve, and I was self-aware enough to know that a human sergeant with 6 months of alien relations experience was not going to smooth over tensions that had been building for decades. What I did do was make sure that neither queen was operating on incorrect information about the other's positions, because I discovered early on that a significant portion of the tension between them was being sustained by deliberate misinformation that was in someone else's interest to maintain. That someone else was a political faction within the hive called the Velshari Reform Movement, though reform was, as I noted in my observation files with some irritation, a generous translation of what they actually wanted, which was a reversion. They wanted the Viren hive to pull back from the Compact, renegotiate its treaty terms from a position of isolation, and reassert what they characterized as traditional sovereignty. They were politically coherent, well-organized, and had been growing in influence inside the Hive Council for 3 years. The assassination attempt had not gone as they planned, but it had given them something unexpected, a narrative, and narratives, I had learned, are sometimes more dangerous than weapons. The narrative was this, that a Viren queen who owed Velsha to an outsider, a human, of all species, from a civilization that had been part of the Compact for less than 40 years, was compromised, weakened. That Velsha freely given to a non-Viren was a symptom of a queen who had become too enmeshed with Compact politics to defend hive interests. That both queens, doubly bound, were now effectively operating under outside influence. It was, if you squinted at it from the right angle and ignored everything you knew about how Velsha actually worked, superficially plausible. And superficially plausible, delivered consistently to the right audience, is enough. I became aware of this narrative on the 3rd month. I did not become aware of it through official intelligence channels. The Compact's intelligence arm was still processing the assassination attempt's aftermath and had not yet focused on the political dimensions. I became aware of it because I was invisible, and invisible people hear things. Specifically, I heard 2 members of the Velshari Reform Movement's outer council discussing it in a corridor outside a trade session, because they were standing next to a ventilation junction, and I was on the other side of a partition making a note about the afternoon's meeting schedule, and they did not notice me because why would they notice a human? I did not do anything about it that day. I went back to my room, made coffee, and started writing. The pressure on both queens increased noticeably in month 4. I saw it in the way Saravith handled her council briefings. The precision she used became sharper, more defensive. I saw it in the way Dalira restructured her court meetings to be more formal, more documented, as if she expected scrutiny and was preempting it. They were both reacting to something, and the something was the Velshari movement's quiet campaign within the Hive Council. I raised it with Saravith directly, in one of our private sessions. She was quiet for a long time after I spoke. Her primary limbs did the thing they did when she was thinking hard, a subtle, continuous adjustment of position that was not quite packing and not quite stillness. I am aware of the movement, she said finally. How much of what they're saying is reaching the full council? I asked. Enough, she said. They have support in the outer council seats, enough to call a formal review. Of what? Of Velsha's applicability, she paused. They intend to argue formally that Velsha cannot apply to a non-Viren recipient, that the doctrine was written for relations within the hive, and that extending it outward to a compact soldier is legally invalid. I thought about that. If they succeed in invalidating it, I said, what happens? Politically, she said, it removes the protection that Velsha provides you. It also, by implication, removes the formal constraint it places on Delira and myself. She paused again. It would also be the first time in 4,000 years that a valid Velsha bond has been invalidated by council vote. Would it succeed? I said. If it reaches a formal tribunal, she said, and the reform movement controls the tribunal's council seats, it might. Hive law allows for council interpretation of doctrine in cases of unprecedented application. I sat with that. Then I said the thing I had been thinking about for 2 weeks. There is another option, I said. I could release you from the bond voluntarily, formally. The Velsha holder can dissolve the obligation by free declaration. I had read this in the archival materials, buried in Volume 4 of the Compact's Hive law documentation. If I declare that the Velsha is satisfied and the bond dissolved, the movement loses its argument. There is nothing to invalidate, and you both regain full political freedom. Saravath looked at me. The silence lasted long enough that I started to think I had said something wrong. You would do that, she said. It was not a question. It was the tone of someone testing whether what they just heard was real. If it helps you, I said, yes. Another silence. You would give up, she said carefully, the most significant political protection available to a non-Viren individual in compact space, without being asked, to make our political situation less complicated. You didn't ask to owe me anything, I said. That's not how it happened. It was never a transaction. She looked at me for a very long time with her compound eyes, and I held still under the weight of it. I know, she said. That is the part that is hardest to explain to my counsel. A pause. Velsha was given by someone who expected nothing and wanted nothing. Dissolving it would not reduce that. It cannot be reduced. She moved to the window, which she often did when she was working through something. My counsel would accept the dissolution. The reform movement would use it as evidence that the Velsha was never genuine, that you were acting under compact diplomatic instruction to create, and then relinquish the bond as a political maneuver. That's not true, I said. No, she said, but truth and political narrative are not always the same speed. I had already had this conversation with Delira 3 days earlier. Delira had listened to the dissolution option with the same attention she gave everything and then said, in her direct way, you would release the obligation freely. And when I confirmed it, she had been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, do you understand that the act of offering that freely is the most Velsha thing I have observed in a non-Viren? And when I said I didn't know what that meant exactly, she said, it means that the bond is not between a queen and a soldier. It is between two individuals who understand what it means to act without expectation of return. I had not said anything to that. I had thought about it for a week. I did not dissolve the bond. Neither queen wanted me to. And I had realized, in the quiet of my own thinking, that I did not want to either, not for political protection, but because what we had built in those 6 months of travel and conversation and invisible watching was something that did not have a core designation or a compact protocol and did not need one. Month 5 was when the reform movement made their formal move. They filed a petition with the Hive Council requesting a formal tribunal review of the Velsha's validity. They were careful and thorough. They cited 12 precedents from Hive history where Velsha had been challenged on the grounds of situational inappropriateness. They requested that both queens be formally required to present their case for the bond's legitimacy before a council tribunal of 15 members, 9 of whom, they had ensured through months of careful coalition building, were aligned with their position. Saraveth sent me the petition documentation the same evening it was filed. She included no note. She did not need to. Delira sent me a separate message 30 minutes later. It said, "They move. You should know everything now. I will send the rest of the files." The rest of the files were remarkable. Delira had been watching the reform movement for 8 months, longer than I had. She had documentation I had not seen, intelligence from inside the outer council, financial records showing the movement's funding sources, and a detailed map of the coalition they had built over the past 3 years. She sent all of it to me in a single encrypted package with a note that said, "I trusted no one else to do something useful with this." I looked at that for a moment. Then I made a cup of coffee and read every single file. It took most of the night. I wrote notes as I read. By the time the station's lighting shifted to its morning cycle, I had 17 pages of documentation, 4 pages of cross-referenced analysis, and a very clear picture of exactly how the Velshari reform movement had built itself, who was funding it, what their end goal was, and where every single one of their arguments for the tribunal was going to come from. The tribunal was scheduled for 6 weeks out. That gave me 6 weeks to prepare for a council proceeding in an alien legal system I had no formal training in a political environment that was not designed for human participation, to defend a Velsha bond that I had created by instinct in 8 seconds, and now apparently needed to maintain with a level of legal sophistication I was going to have to construct entirely from scratch. I drank my coffee. I opened a new document. I got to work. The tribunal chamber was built in the old style. That is what Saraveth had told me when she described what I would be walking into, and when I actually walked into it on the morning of the hearing, I understood what old style meant. No soft lighting, no diplomatic courtesy seating, no ambient temperature calibrated to everyone's comfort. The chamber was a large semicircle of elevated stone seats, dark Viren granite, polished until it reflected light, arranged around a central floor space that served simultaneously as the speaking area, the evidence presentation zone, and in the history of the hive's legal tradition, what could only be described as the place where things were decided. The 15 council members occupied the elevated seats. The queens were given chairs at the chamber's flanking positions. I was placed in the center. Not beside them, in the center, alone on the floor. I had been told this was correct protocol for a Velsha testimony. The Velsha holder stands in the center and speaks. I had also been told, by a compact legal advisor who spent 3 hours with me the previous evening looking increasingly pale, that no non-Viren individual had ever stood in that center position before. I was in my liaison corps uniform, the compact crest, the Viren hive glyph in amber thread below it. My arm had fully healed 2 months earlier. I stood straight and kept my hands at my sides and looked at the 15 council members who were going to spend the next several hours determining whether the 2 people I had bled for would be politically damaged or protected. The tribunal's presiding officer, a senior council member named Velthan, opened proceedings in hive language, which was then translated through the chamber's interpretation system. The reform movement's legal advocate, a carefully composed Viren named Kalis, presented the opening case first. It was precise and well-constructed. I listened to every word. The argument was essentially this. Velsha, as a doctrine, was established in an era before the compact existed. It was written to govern relations within the hive, between queens and their warriors, between castes, between individuals who shared Viren biology, culture, and law. Applying Velsha to a human was not a fulfillment of the doctrine. It was a misapplication of it. A misapplication that, by consequence, created a false constraint on 2 queens and a false elevation of an outsider to a status he had no legitimate standing to occupy. The bond should be declared void. The queens should be released from it, and the compact should be formally requested to understand that internal hive legal doctrine is not subject to external diplomatic pressure. It was well said. I watched the 9 reform-aligned council members as Kalis spoke, and most of their expressions confirmed what I had already calculated. They were not undecided. They were waiting for the vote. Velthan turned to me when Kalis finished. "The Velsha holder may respond," he said. I stepped forward. The chamber went quiet in the way that large rooms go quiet when something is about to happen that everyone understands is significant. I had spent 6 weeks preparing. I had read everything, every page of Velsha doctrine, every historical case, every precedent Kalis had cited, and 60 more he had not. I had read the Hive's founding legal codes in compact translation. I had corresponded, through official channels, with 3 compact scholars of Viren law who had given me materials, and occasionally expressions of concerned disbelief that I was actually going to do this. I was going to do this. But I did not start with the law. "I want to tell you what happened," I said. My voice was even. I had practiced the even. Not the legal framing of it, not the political context of it. What actually happened in the order it happened as I experienced it. I told them about the East Wall drone, about the look I had seen pass between 2 individuals who thought no one was paying attention. I told them about 11 meters of floor and 2 seconds of time. I told them about the war staff on the dais railing and the angle and the physics of 200 kilograms hitting a 3-meter pole. I did not make it dramatic. That was the choice I had made after many drafts of how to approach this. The reform movement expected either fear or performance. They had prepared for both. They had not prepared for a factual account delivered by someone who was not angry, not defensive, and not trying to impress anyone. "I have been asked why I acted," I said. "In this chamber, in the context of Velsha's requirements, the why matters as much as the what. Velsha requires that the protecting action be taken without calculation of personal survival. I have been asked by 2 queens, by compact medical staff, by compact legal advisors, and by 3 separate species of researchers why a human individual would take physical action with no reasonable survival probability." I paused. The honest answer is that I do not know. I saw it happening and I moved. There was no calculation. There was no decision in the way that word is usually meant. There was only the moment, and in the moment the movement. The chamber was completely still. "I understand that this is difficult to model," I said. "I have had the same conversation with everyone I have spoken to in the past 6 months. My species does not have a clean answer for it. We have been asking ourselves why we do things like this for our entire recorded history, and the closest we have come is this. We act because the alternative, not acting, is something we cannot make peace with afterward." I let that settle. Then I shifted. "The advocate has argued that Velsha cannot apply to a non-Viren because the doctrine was written before the compact existed," I said. "I would like to address that argument directly, because it is the most interesting argument in this proceeding, and it deserves a real answer." I had Kalis's full attention now. He had not expected me to find it interesting. Velsha's founding text, the Third Covenant of the First Hive, written in what the compact calendar translates to approximately 4,000 years ago, contains one sentence that this entire proceeding rests on, I said. I have it here. I produced a single card from my pocket, physical, not a datapad, because physical documents carry a different weight in a formal setting, and I had learned this from Delira's files. The sentence reads, in the standard compact translation, Velsha is the recognition between living beings that survival is not owned but given, and that what is given freely cannot be returned except through the same freedom. I looked up. I want to note what that sentence does not say. It does not say Velsha is the recognition between Virens. It does not say between hive members. It says between living beings. Kalis shifted in his position. It was the first time he had shifted. 4,000 years ago, I said, the hive did not know there were other living beings in the galaxy. The doctrine was written to govern relations within the hive because within the hive was all that existed. It was not written to exclude non-virons. It was written before non-virons were a category. I set the card down. If the doctrine had been written today, knowing what the hive now knows, that the galaxy contains 40 species of living beings, do you believe the founders would have written between living beings differently? The chamber was quiet. I also want to address, I said, the argument that my Velsha status represents outside influence on the Queen's decision-making. I looked at the 9 reform-aligned council members directly. If you believe that the queens of the hive are so weakened by gratitude that they cannot make independent decisions, I would respectfully suggest that you have misunderstood both the queens and the doctrine. Velsha does not remove a queen's authority. It acknowledges that a queen receives something she could not have received from power alone, the willingness of another being to place itself between her and harm, not for gain, not for position, but because it was the right thing to do. A queen who cannot recognize that and who cannot honor it with the same freedom it was given would be a lesser queen, not a stronger one. I heard something change in the room, not noise, the opposite of noise. The kind of deep quiet that happens when something has been said that reaches past the argument and into something harder to dismiss. I would like to now present, I said, some additional information that I believe the Council will find relevant to its understanding of this proceeding and the movement that has brought it here. I had prepared 17 pages of documentation. I did not read all 17 pages. I selected 12 specific points, each one sourced, each one verifiable, each one delivered with the same factual flatness I had used throughout, and I presented them in order. The funding sources for the Velshari reform movement, traced through 3 layers of financial intermediaries to 3 outer council members who were also serving as tribunal participants. The internal communications, obtained through legal compact intelligence channels, filed with the appropriate oversight board, admissible under both compact and hive law, in which the movement's inner council had discussed using the Velsha situation as a political lever before the tribunal petition was even filed. The timeline of the original assassination attempt, cross-referenced against the movement's internal planning records, which showed a 4-month gap between the movement's founding and the drone radicalization effort, a gap that was not coincidental, because the movement had been the ones creating the conditions that led to the radicalization. The assassination, I said, was not the reform movement's first action, it was their third. The first was the radicalization campaign. The second was the narrative campaign that followed the incident. This tribunal is the fourth. I looked at Velthan, the presiding officer. I am not presenting this to condemn the movement's political beliefs. They have every legal right to advocate for a different relationship between the hive and the compact. I am presenting this because the council deserves to know that this proceeding was engineered specifically. And I have the documentation to support this, to achieve a political outcome that has nothing to do with Velsha's validity, and everything to do with removing 2 queens from power before the main treaty negotiation concludes. The chamber did not go quiet this time. It filled with sound, not chaos, but the urgent, overlapping sounds of 15 council members processing information simultaneously. 3 of the 9 reform-aligned members were looking at the documentation I had submitted to the tribunal clerk with expressions that ranged from pale to actively alarmed. Velthan raised his hand for order. It took 2 full minutes for the room to settle. Kalis spoke next in his rebuttal period, and he was careful and contained and gave nothing away in his face. But the rebuttal was shorter than his opening. He addressed the Velsha doctrine argument and did not address the financial records. I noted this. So, I was sure, did the council members who were not already aligned. There was a recess. I went to a side room and drank water and stared at the wall. One of Saravath's drone attendants brought me a plate of food I did not touch. Compact legal advisor Nora Hayes, who had spent the previous 6 weeks looking increasingly pale, came and sat across from me and said nothing for about a minute and then said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" I said. "Build an argument like that," she said. "I read a lot," I said, "and I watch rooms." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "They're going to vote in your favor." "You think so?" I said. "3 of the reform bloc switched positions during the recess," she said. "I can't tell you how I know that, but I know it." A pause. "You didn't win this on Velsha doctrine. You won it on the funding records." "The doctrine argument was true," I said. "The funding records were evidence. You need both." She nodded slowly. "You've done this before." "No," I said, "but I paid attention to people who had." When the council reconvened, the vote took 11 minutes to formally process. The reform movement's petition was rejected. The Velsha between myself and both queens was affirmed as valid, binding, and consistent with Hive doctrine in its original and intended meaning. 4 additional council members, not part of the reform bloc, but neutral, submitted a concurrent recommendation that the compact open a formal investigation into the documented funding irregularities and the connection to the assassination attempt. The 3 implicated outer council members were taken into the Hive authorities' custody before the session ended. The chamber cleared slowly. I remained in the center position until the clerk indicated I could move, which felt correct somehow. When the floor was mostly empty and the formal session had been officially closed, I looked up and found that Saravith had not left her chair. She was looking at me across the empty chamber the way she had looked at me from the dais step 6 months ago, but not with the same expression. Something had shifted in it. Something had been added. I walked to where she sat. "You presented the doctrine argument well," she said. "It was a good argument," I said. "It helped that it was true." "You prepared for 6 weeks," she said. "You read 4,000 years of Hive law in compact translation." "I had time," I said. "You had other things you could have done with the time," she said. It was not a small statement. She meant it in the way that someone who has thought about something carefully means a thing. "I know," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The chamber was nearly empty now. Her remaining attendants were at the far door, waiting without approaching. "When I was made queen," she said, "I was told by my predecessor that the measure of a queen is not what she commands but what she inspires. I did not fully understand it then." A pause. "I understand it better now." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which felt right. "The treaty negotiations conclude in 2 weeks," she said. "After that, the compact's formal session at Vethari Orbital ends. Both courts return to their home stations." She looked at me directly. "What do you intend to do?" It was a real question. I had been thinking about it for weeks without a clean answer. "The compact's liaison position doesn't have a home posting," I said. "I go where I'm needed." "Yes," she said, "but where do you want to go?" It was the first time anyone, any queen, any officer, anyone in the entire compact had asked me that. Not where I was assigned or where I was sent or what was needed of me. Where I wanted. I thought about it honestly. "I think," I said, "that I want to keep doing what I've been doing, watching rooms, writing notes nobody asked for, sitting in corridors near ventilation junctions and hearing things." I paused. "I'm apparently not bad at it." "You are," she said, "extremely good at it." She stood, which environ posture signals the close of a conversation, but she did not move away yet. "Marcus." "Yes." "You said in the chamber that your species acts because not acting is something you cannot make peace with afterward." She paused. "Is that true for you personally?" "Yes," I said. "Even when the cost is high," she said. "Especially when the cost is high," I said. She looked at me for a long time. Then, she said quietly, You are exactly as rare among your own people as you are among mine." She walked to her attendants and left the chamber. Her footsteps were quiet on the old stone floor, the silence of something that does not need to announce itself. I stood alone in the center of the empty chamber for a moment. Then I walked out. Delira was in the corridor outside. She was leaning against the wall in a way that was deliberately casual, a posture I had come to recognize as her way of communicating that a conversation was going to be informal regardless of the setting. She was holding something, and she held it out as I approached. It was an honor blade, Viron-made from the quality of the material, a straight, single-edged blade with no ornamentation beyond the hive's crest worked into the grip. The grip, I noticed immediately, was sized for 2 human hands. It had been custom-made. "Delira," I said. "It is not a gift," she said, the way she said things that she meant seriously. "Honor blades are not gifts. They are statements." She paused. "This one says that the individual who carries it has demonstrated Velsha understanding, the willingness to act without expectation of return." I took it. It was lighter than it looked and perfectly balanced. "I don't know what to say," I said. "You do not need to say anything," she said. "That is also part of what it means." We stood in the corridor for a moment. Outside the chamber windows, Vethari orbital rotated slowly against the dark, and the stars beyond it did what stars always do, which is exist with complete indifference to the small and significant things happening in their light. "You will go to Sira's court," Delira said, "and to mine, and wherever the compact sends you after that." "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. "It is useful to have someone watching the rooms." She pushed off the wall and walked down the corridor toward her own delegation. She did not look back. Nora Hayes appeared at my elbow approximately 30 seconds later with a datapad and an expression that was trying to process several large things at once. "The Compact Diplomatic Board transmitted a formal communication while you were in the chamber," she said. "Earth's government has been reclassified in the Compact framework. Auxiliary member status has been removed. Core diplomatic partner, full council participation rights, permanent seat on the Interspecies Security Oversight Board." She paused. "It takes effect immediately." I looked at the datapad. "Who authorized it?" I said. "Both queens jointly requested it as a Velsha complementary action," she said. "The board approved it unanimously. Apparently, when both queens submit a joint request on the same day the tribunal rules in their favor, the board does not take long to discuss." I handed the datapad back. "Vale," she said, "do you understand what that means for Earth?" "Yes," I said. "Does it feel significant to you?" I thought about that honestly. It felt significant the way large things feel, more like weight than celebration. A quiet kind of enormity. "It feels right," I said. "Not for me, just in general. It feels like the way things should have been." She nodded slowly. She was going to say something else, but her communication implant chimed, and she looked at it and excused herself. And I was alone in the corridor with an honor blade in my hands and the sound of the station's ventilation system in the walls. I went back to my quarters. I put the blade on the shelf above my cot, next to a thermos of terrible coffee and 3 notebooks filled with observation notes nobody had asked for. I sat on the standard-issue cot that I had been sleeping on for 6 months in a station 6 hours from Earth, in a galaxy that had decided, sometime in the past 6 months, to take humanity slightly more seriously. The compact still sent me to the postings nobody else wanted. The uniform was cleaner. The title was longer. The coffee was still terrible. Some things do not change and probably should not. But when I walked into a room now, any room on any station before any delegation in any of the 40 compact member species, something shifted. Eyes moved differently. Conversations adjusted. Not with pity. Not with the polite condescension that humanity had received as its welcome to the galaxy. Something else. something I had decided not to name, because some things are better understood through feeling than through language. I finished the coffee. I opened a new notebook. I started watching again.